Let me just start by saying I'm Adam Watson with Washington County Extension Office. I'm one of our ag agents. And as we go through tonight, if I make any references to any commercial products or specific brands, just understand that is not intended as an endorsement. Myself nor the university endorses products. The other caveat to remember is anything I say does not overrule laws, and in particular, pesticide label instructions. Those are the law. We have to follow those. And so while tonight's conversation is not primarily about pest control, if something comes up, remember, nothing I say will supersede what the label says. We want to talk about pruning because pruning is critical to fruit production. It's important to reduce diseases. It's important to encourage fruit production. And what I find typically is it's not that people aren't pruning well, it's that they don't prune at all or they don't prune enough. And so I think it's intimidating to people. I don't think it has to be. The reason it's so important is when we increase the air circulation as well as sunlight penetration within these trees, it helps reduce wetness. Wetness promotes disease. So we're talking about bacterial diseases, fungal diseases. The wetter things are, the more problems we have. So anything we can do to reduce wetness directly reduces the incidence of disease. When we're talking about encouraging fruit production, what we're actually doing is we are making sure to direct as much energy as possible into the reproductive growth rather than vegetative growth. And so we're actually direct where that energy goes to give us the most production. I also want to take a moment to mention training, because when we're talking about young trees, especially, pruning, cutting things off is not the only thing we can do. Training is also important. And what training allows us to do is basically manipulate that plant shape through methods other than pruning. We'll talk a little bit about those. The thing to understand, whether we're talking about implementing some training, where we're talking about pruning, when we buy a tree, it has not been properly pruned or trained for our orchard. I have yet to see a tree come out of a garden center or anywhere else that arrives in a perfect structural format that we would want to have for our orchard. And so that means when we are planting it, we got to be putting in place that plan to do the pruning and training necessary to get the results we want. I'll also mention before we dive into it, this time of year, if you're out in the orchard, no matter what sort of fruit you have, if you see fruit mummies, and here we have grapes as well as some peaches, in the upper left-hand corner of the right picture is a dried peach. Obviously, this was taken late in summer, not this time of year, but if you find those dried fruits left on trees in your orchard or on vines in your vineyard, go ahead and remove those, because those are a great source of disease or a source of inoculum, so that those diseases can begin and reinfect new plant tissues that are there. So sanitation is an important one when it comes to disease control. And because we're out in the orchard and because those trees and vines don't have leaves on them, oftentimes now's a great time to pick those off. Certainly we can do it earlier in the season or in the winter, but now's a great time to do it if we have not. We'll be talking a lot of different language tonight. Some of it may be familiar, some of it maybe not. These are some major terms you'll see often repeated in the resources, and I'll mention some of these tonight as well. Scaffold branches are just main branches of a tree. That's where we have most of our production occurring. Water sprouts are those adventitious shoots that shoot straight up on a tree. They're generally one response to pruning, depending how we're pruning. Hangers is sometimes a term that is used for any branch growing down or that originates on the underside of a branch. By and large, those are not desirable. The other thing to make mention of is branch angle or crotch angle, and that's basically the angle between the branch and its point of attachment. There are some desirable characteristics as well as some that we'd like to avoid. And a lot of that has to do with hormone flow in the branch as well as relative strength or weakness. So we'll talk about those. It's important when we talk about pruning to really understand what part of the tree has grown in the past year, or what is one annual growth. Here we have, and if I remember correctly, this is a plum, but those stacked rings immediately below and slightly screened left of the arrow are the rings or ridges that we look for. And so to the right of the arrow was 2 years ago. To the left of the arrow was last year's growth. And it's those stacked rings that lets us pick out where that growth begins for a season. We often will see color differences. In this particular one, it's not necessarily dramatic, but if you look to the right, it's a little bit darker color. Oftentimes you'll see a distinct different color, and that can be another clue, and then you look for those ridges. The reason we want to look for this is that it helps us determine where to make cuts. In some scenarios, we want to remove most, or at least a good portion of last year's growth. And because of that, we want to understand how we can identify that on a tree. One thing to understand about apples and pears, they mostly flower and thus fruit on short twigs called spurs. So one thing I want to encourage you not to do is go out into your orchard and start cutting off every little stubby branch you see because you think, well, these aren't growing well. They're not going to grow dramatically. That's not their job. What they are flowering spurs. And so that's where fruit can occur. And most apples and pears utilize this. So this is not uncommon to see. However, not every apple and pear does this, particularly some of our apple varieties are what's called tip bearing. So rather than having these short little side branches, these spurs, they actually have their flower buds on the very tip of branches. So if you are going in and removing all the tips on a tip bearing tree, you're cutting off all the flowers. So if you never see a flower on your tree and it's been multiple years, it may be that you have one of these varieties that are either fully tip bearing or at least partially tip bearing. And so there you can see some common ones. Empire is one that has, if I remember correctly, quite a bit of disease resistance. So it's one that we often recommend people plant. You'll see it on a lot of recommended lists. So just understand that it does not have those spurs. It's actually a tip bearer. Here's an example of that. On the left, we have a tip bearer, and there you see that larger, rounder bud as they begin to swell at the very tip of a branch. And on the right, we have that very short branch. Obviously, if we were looking at that as a growing branch, you'd say that's not a branch that's growing well. It's actually perfectly fine because it's not a regular branch. It's that fruiting spur. When it comes to pruning, there's two types of pruning cuts. Pretty much every pruning cut is going to be classified as one or the other. There's heading back cuts. Heading back cuts actually encourage growth. What we do with a heading cut is we are removing the bud that is at the end of a branch. The reason that's important is that apical bud or dominant bud releases hormones, auxin specifically. Those hormones actually prevent the buds from behind it from growing. So it actually inhibits that growth. It prevents those other buds from growing. When we come in and do a heading cut, we've removed that source of hormone. And so now we don't have the gradient of hormone flowing down that branch. And so now those buds that had been dormant suddenly spring forth and start growing. So this is why when we do a lot of heading cuts, you see a lot of growth. And this is not just on trees. If you think of pinching back mums or herbs or things like that, it's the exact same principle. This is a plant principle, not only a fruit tree principle. This is also why we tip prune blackberries, for instance. We want to see more side branching growth. So just understand that we do this typically on young trees where we want to promote branching because we don't have an adequate number or spacing that we like, and also as renewal on mature trees. There are times when we want to get new growth on an older tree. And so this is where heading back cuts are done. And you need to be aware heading back cuts will increase your pruning next year, essentially, because again, you're releasing those dormant buds. The exact opposite effect is our thinning cuts. So what we do with a thinning cut is we remove a branch back at its point of origin. So whether it's the trunk or a branch, we go back to where it starts from and we remove it. By doing this, we're not altering that flow of hormone in the plant, and we don't have a lot of buds that then become growing. So thinning cuts are great when we have a canopy that is already more full than we would like. We'd like to thin it out because, again, one of the primary things we're wanting to do is open that canopy up to both sunlight and air penetration. And so thinning cuts are critical to that. If we tried to do that same practice only utilizing heading cuts, you end up with a tree that actually may be more full, more thickly foliaged than it was to begin with. So thinning cuts are absolutely critical to making sure that we get that openness and that penetration of sunlight and air. So we do use this on both young and mature trees as needed. Sometimes we're doing it on young trees, such as depicted here, where we have a branch too close to another or directly over top of another, and there's just simply not enough room for all of them to grow. And so that is when we can do a thinning cut on smaller trees. On mature trees, when we have too much growth, again, more than we want in an area, we would thin it out. And we don't want to see new buds breaking and more growth happening. When we are looking at branches, we do want to look at their point of attachment or that branch angle or crotch. The reason we want to look at it is the strength. And so what we have here is on the left is a wonderfully strong branch. It's probably between 45 to 65 degrees as the angle of attachment. And what we see there is actually that the entire branch across its diameter is attached to that trunk or that other branch. There's full attachment. On the other picture on the right, what we'll see here, if you see my laser pointer, this darkened brown area, there is no actual continuation of attachment between the trunk and this branch. What we have there is included bark. It is literally bark that is dead. It's kind of squeezed between the both of them. And because of that, that means that branch joint has no attachment until we get to the underside. So only this portion of that branch is attached. So if you imagine if we have a heavy fruit load on that branch, if we have high winds, we're going to have a long lever there that's being manipulated, and the only point of attachment is on that bottom side, as opposed to this side where we have full connection. That's why we see those continuing lines. We see that full connection and thus much greater strength. This is exactly why Bradford pear trees split apart all this time. They have very tight branch angles, and included bark makes them extremely weak. And so if you look, next time we have spring storms, you can probably find a Bradford pear somewhere where that has failed. Look where it breaks, and you will see this. And so this is not just a fruit tree. This is actually a strong branch if we're talking about shade trees or any other. So it applies across our woody plants. All right, let me get rid of my laser pointer. It has real world applications. So this is my office in downtown Jonesboro. There's a tree laying on top of our lovely 1950s former health department building. What happened is we had codominant stems next door on a tree. And so the picture on the left, obviously a tree's laying on top of a structure. On the right, you see the actual breakage. So again, that dark area that we see here is included bark. You can see where the breakage happens on the bottom of that codominant trunk or stem. And so and now how old was this? 40 years old? I don't know. So it didn't fail immediately, but there came a point in time, and this actually happened when Hurricane Helene went through. This happened the morning of the 27th. And so, again, there was no physical structural attachment in this area. It was only along that bottom. And this is exactly what happens. It splits out.
What causes the included bark?
The included bark is there because you have two stems growing close together. The angle between the two of them is too close. So as they both enlarge, it squeezes the bark. When you have that 45 to 65 degree angle, they both more or less grow in a way that they don't create that included bark.
And you see that all the time. I always thought
You
that
do
was
see
rot
splitting.
or something.
Yep.
Now I know what it is.
You will see trees splitting out all the time. And a lot of people say, yeah, it rotted. If you actually look closely and scrape that back, you've got sound wood behind that dark area. It is not rotted. It is actually just, it wasn't attached. So to be like nailing a 2x4 on just one edge of the bottom instead of along its length. Kind of the same idea. It's just weak attachment. So this is critically important for longevity of fruit trees. When we have a heavy fruit load, we have poor choice of angle branches, we're going to have failures. I also need to mention tonight, we don't use any sort of pruning paint, asphalt coatings, or anything else on pruning cuts or wounds. There is one product that I'm aware of some arborists are in favor of using. It's a product that is made and sold in Europe. I don't even know if it's distributed in North America. That might be the only one, but that would be with the caveat of I don't know that we have the research to back it up, but I know some arborists are in favor of it. What we do have research is that all the paintings and coatings that they used to use do not work. They actually cause more damage. So trees actually don't heal. They grow around wounds. And because of that, when we put these things on there, it can actually interrupt that process. It can hold moisture in, which invites disease and insects. So don't use any sort of paintings. And we can still find them for sale in stores.
Oh, yeah.
But do not use those. What we also want to understand about fruit trees is not every fruit tree is pruned in the same style or form. Obviously, stone fruits, that's our peaches, plums, cherries, nectarines, etc. We can see those being different than apple and pear because apple and pear are both in the rose family. But we also have differences on how we can approach it and how we want to care for it. So stone fruits, we tend to do an open center, or sometimes referred to as open vase, where we don't have a central leader. Apples and pears, typically we are doing central leaders, but we can also do multi-leaders if we want to. Again, we want to structure that tree in a way that works for us, so there's not one single correct answer. And we always have the exceptions. So we do have some very strongly dwarfed trellised varieties that have to grow on a trellis and that are very columnar in growth habit. And then we also have things like espalier, where we manipulate the plant more than we ordinarily would. So there can always be exceptions to the open center, central leader, or multi-leader. So let's say we're planting a peach. So we've got that dormant peach. Either we've already got it planted out there in the orchard or we're looking to plant it soon. The proper way to prune it at planting is basically cut everything off. And this is always so hard to get people to do. The reason we want to do that is, again, it goes back to the statement I made earlier. When these plants are leaving the nursery, they do not have the structure and form that is needed to be most successful. So this is a perfect example. This is a peach tree. It is a central leader tree right now. So if you want to envision a central leader tree, think of a basic Christmas tree shape. There's one central point that's the highest. Other branches are lower, and it's kind of broader at the bottom than at the top. We do not prune peach trees to a central leader. We have to get more air in there. We have to get sunlight into that interior. We cannot leave it this way. So peach tree, we're setting ourselves up for heartache if we don't do this. So what we want to do is basically, we would try to figure out the height at which we would like to have permanent branches. So typically that's 18 to 24 inches off the ground. We can leave a slight stub if we have some branches there that work for us. So they're well arranged around the stem. Typically we want a radial arrangement, and we'll have some pictures from above to talk about that more, but we like them to be evenly distributed around a tree. Today I actually happen to be out in a home orchard For whatever reason, I don't know why, there was an apple tree that they had received and planted that basically there was branches only on one side of the tree. There was no damage on the other side, so it wasn't apparent why there weren't any branches, but for whatever reason, there happened to be no branches on one side. So in that case, even if they were perfect branches, we still need branches on the other side too. So we can, again, we're going to remove branches, but we can leave slight stubs for branches that are basically where we want them to be. Normally, when we prune, we don't leave stubs. We do sometimes when we're trying to get regrowth from that same point. And I'll talk about this again, because again, normally when we prune woody things, do not leave stubs. I've got some pictures that tell us why. We want to top the tree about 8 inches above that highest scaffold branch that we're establishing. So we should have a stub, our highest stub that we leave on the stick, and it is a stick just sticking there. We want to be about 8 inches higher than that and go ahead and top it. The reason we do this, it goes back to we're trying to create that structure from day one.
What do you mean by that? Sorry.
Okay.
Tree 8 inches above.
Right. So in this picture, you see in the right-hand picture where you see the slanting cut at the top. If you look below on that right-hand side, you'll see that little stub. That's approximately 8 inches. And so we don't actually cut or top them right close to that top scaffold branch because we can often have some dieback. So we want to give some space there and make sure that we don't have that branch that we're trying to leave immediately die. And so that's why we have that little bit of space. And we'll have some more pictures here in just a second too. So I said we don't leave stubs. What we're really doing in this scenario is what's also called a Dutch cut. A Dutch cut is where we basically leave a little bit of a branch because normally we find the branch collar, which we'll talk about in a minute, and we cut immediately outside of that because basically we're doing a thinning cut here. But because we want to promote a new branch to grow in the same spot, we do leave this stub to hopefully get that Dutch cut work for us. So again, very unusual situation. Normally pruning woody things, we would never leave a stub.
Wouldn't it go down? Doesn't it go down?
Not necessarily, no. So although that bud originates on the underside of the branch, you can see how it's kind of growing out horizontally. Because we have actually topped the tree, that branch is going to want to go straight up. Normally, whenever we top things, when we remove that apical bud, when we stop the auxin from flowing, all the branches want to be that top growing branch. They want to be that central leader because that's the one's getting the most sunlight. So you'll actually get a response when you do those heading back cuts if everything starts shooting up. So that's where we start talking about training. So whenever we do these pruning cuts, sometimes we have to come back and train what's left behind. And we'll talk about that more in just a moment. Apples, we basically do a similar thing. At planting, we top the tree about 6 to 8 inches above the height for that first scaffold branch. So oftentimes we're talking about, we want that first branch around 30 to 32 inches. That doesn't mean it has to be at this height. If you know you have high deer pressure in your orchard and you don't want to do fencing, you may want to raise your trees up. It's going to make other tasks more challenging, like pruning and picking and even spraying. But if you know your lower branches are always going to be getting hammered by deer, those lower branches might want to be higher than you might initially think.
Now, how high can a deer go and feed?
High.
And it's down
Yeah.
back leg.
They will stand up on their back legs so they can reach quite a distance above the ground. So yeah, I'm not saying selecting taller branches is the way to make sure we have no deer pressure in the orchard, but it is one thing to consider. The other thing is, do you want to be able to easily get around and underneath the tree, like with a lawnmower or with wheelbarrows and things like that? You can raise this height up, but typically we're about we want that first branch about 32 inches. Sometimes you'll also hear people talk about doing it about waist height, which is about 32 inches for most people. So around there is generally where we're at. Again, we are heading back to where we just have that stick in the ground. I know this is some of the hardest things to get folks to do, especially if you bought a larger tree. But if you start looking at that larger tree, look at the branch angle, look at the arrangement of those branches around that central trunk. Is that really the architecture you want growing forward. I've yet to see one that looks great. Occasionally you'll have some that look pretty good where maybe a little bit of minimal pruning is needed, but the majority of the time you have to start over. And it's okay. This is what happens in commercial orchards every single time they plant orchards. If it didn't work or if it wasn't a good way to do it, there'd be another way to do it because they're in it to make money. And so this is how we establish those trees to have good production. What we'll see happen, and I mentioned this earlier about those other buds all trying to be that central leader. You see there, you cut it, you get new growth. You've got 3 wannabe central leaders there on that right bottom picture. You select one to be your central leader. You remove the others. There are scenarios, and that tree that had no branches on one side for whatever reason, there are scenarios where we might do something like bud notching, was where we actually cut into the bark above a dormant bud to try to get it to grow. What we're doing is we're literally stopping the flow of oxygen there. And we're doing that to encourage it to grow. So there are scenarios where we might do some bud notching to try to encourage those branches to grow more vigorously. It can be a good way to do that. Here's another depiction of that, just a small notch above a bud. Again, we're literally basically interfering with the piping of the plant. When we do that, we're cutting the pipes so that oxygen doesn't reach that bud and keep it dormant. Don't do this a lot, but there are scenarios where it's a useful tool to know it's out there. I talked about training. So whenever we do these cuts on these newly planted trees, we're going to have a lot of growth happening because it's a heading back cut. Most of that growth is going to want to go straight up. We don't want branches growing straight up. We want that 45 to 65 degree angle. What's great on this young growth is we can train it easily, much more easily than we can come back later and prune it into shape that we want. So we can use something even as simple as clothespins on these young trees. We would put this in after the buds have broken as they've started growing, put that in place. The branch will actually hit that, and it basically causes it to grow out more horizontally rather than straight up. These are something that we would do probably in mid to late May in our region. You can use toothpicks. I think it's a little more fiddly because you got to make sure they're really stuck into the wood well enough that they don't get blown out. And that's where something that clamps like a clothespin, it doesn't take a tremendous amount of force, works well. And basically after about 1 to 2 months, those branches have started stiffening up. They've started lignifying, getting more woody. And at that point you can remove it and they'll stay in the shape that they are. So this is a way we can do that. There's some other ways we can do this with more mature wood where we use spacers or even weights attached to a branch to pull it down to an angle we like. So there are some ways we can train these trees again rather than pruning our way to the shape we exactly want. So here's an example of spreaders. There's plastic ones. The classic wooden ones are like a 1x1 or something like that. It doesn't take a tremendously large piece of wood. But what you do is you drive a finish nail into the end of it, grind the end that's sticking out, the head of the finish nail, so it's at its point as well. Do that on both ends of a piece of wood, and then you stick it between the branch and the trunk. And so that nail holds it in place. And so hopefully it doesn't fall down. And again, this is a great example for something like pear trees, where they're so upright in their growth. We can actually do this to get that growth habit more open. The younger we do this, the better. A 1-year-old branch, that current season growth or even last season growth is much more supple and much more able to be adjusted than even a 2-year-old branch. So when you have branches that are old and woody, you're not going to have a lot of luck with this. This happens with newer growth. You can do it the same season. So, you know, if you're in July and you see these new pear trees growing very upright, go in there then. Spread those branches out that time of year. It works great to do it.
I have a question with the
Sure.
nails on that. Are they like forked out where the limb's right here, or do you put the nail in the limb too?
So ordinarily in the nail scenario, you would put the nail into the limb. You poke it into the bark. It does create a wound. It's a minor wound comparatively. And again, you're doing it to get the benefit. They do have commercially available spreaders that are basically plastic sticks that do have kind of like a fork on the end, so it will ride on a branch.
Okay.
Those are available, but they're not necessary. I have even seen where people would take prunings that have natural branch forks in it and use those to wedge a tree open. All those are possibilities. You can even take weights, attach it to a tree. So take a plastic bottle, fill it with gravel or something like that, and actually tie it and weigh it down. So there's more than one way to spread these limbs to do this training. But again, the point is to open those trees up, prevent that tight branch angle, and get a more desirable shape. We do the primary portion of our pruning in the dormant period. And basically in our area, you can start in January if you want, but anytime February to bloom works great. So we see the warm weather.
I know we'll listen to this.
If you have some
Okay,
varieties that have low chill hour requirements,
It all.
would not be what we would encourage you to do. We would encourage you to actually have higher chill hours. And so when we have recommended list, one of the big functions of that is chill hours. So a tree, once it reaches its chill hours, which is the number of hours above a minimum temperature, but below a certain temperature, they are physiologically ready to bloom, provided you have the environment that allows them to. So because of that, those varieties that have larger requirements do better in our area because they bloom later. So late frost in spring can ruin our fruit crops sometimes regularly, especially with things like peaches. So generally we do this in the dormant season. There is the option to do some summer pruning in June, especially to thin out. So we're not heading back in the summer. We're only doing thinning cuts. That can be good if we've had to do quite a bit of heading back and we know we're going to have a lot of growth, more than we want. We can do June pruning to thin that out. Typically in the orchard, we prune most hardy to least. The reason we do that, and hardy is just the ones that are later blooming and less likely to be damaged by a frost. The reason we do that is that one of the responses to pruning can be for the plant to say, hey, let's start growing. And so because of that, we start with things like apples and pears, and then we work our way towards peaches. And in fact, peaches are so challenging with their bloom period in our area, it wouldn't be wrong to wait until after peaches have bloomed or while they're in bloom that we actually prune those. And part of that is that way we're not cutting off any blooms. If we have, a tree is probably going to set fruit on less than 10% of the blooms that are present and have a great crop. So we don't need every bloom on the tree. But if you have a frost that kills 90% of your blooms, and then you start removing, 20% of what's left, that's even fewer flowers. So we can wait until bloom period to actually prune those peaches with the hope that we're preserving as many blooms as possible. By the same token, because of hardiness, we start with the oldest trees first and the youngest trees last. We are in a time period right now where it's not a bad time to be pruning anything out there in the orchard, with maybe the exception of peaches. We can wait on them. But certainly, if we continue to have days as nice as today and yesterday, those trees are going to be blooming probably earlier than we want, unfortunately. When it comes to pruning in the orchard, by and large, we're looking at hand tools. And I realize that there are a lot of battery-powered reciprocating saws and things like that, and you can actually get pruning blades for those. And a pruning blade or saw is not the same thing as a carpentry saw. Teeth pattern and arrangement's totally different because cutting green wet wood is very different than cutting seasoned wood. So basically neither one does the other one's job well. So we wouldn't want to use our pruning saws in a carpentry application. We would find they don't perform well and vice versa. But generally we want to do hand tools. And part of this is we want to be getting to things early. We want them to be no older than 1 year for the majority of our cutting. because what that means is we're staying on top of it. If we each year do the pruning, do the training, we are creating a plant that we don't need to bring out a chainsaw to fix. So certainly there are battery powered options that are out there and can work well, but most of your trees are going to be done with just your bypass pruners that you see there on the left. The saw in the center might have an 8 or 10-inch blade. And of course, we can't always use the loppers. That gives us more leverage. So if you have challenges with hand strength, but there are a lot of pruning hand pruners out there that have rotating handles. They're more ergonomic and things like that that are helpful in those situations. I generally encourage people to wear a hat. Goggles are not a bad idea, especially the larger the tree is or older trees that we're trying to rehabilitate. You've got a lot of branches in there and you're liable to poke yourself. So a hat and goggles can help prevent a injury. And so it's useful to have those. I talked about this earlier. Trees never heal. These are actually on dogwood trees because I happened to be at a place that had a little grove of dogwood trees and I got to look and I'm like, hey, I've got some good examples here. So on the left, we left a stub when we pruned. It died back. But you can see there that collar has never been able to close like you see all the way on the right. On the right, we have a well-made pruning cut. We have that inward rolling wound wood, which is completely closed. So when you see donut shapes and things like that on a tree, that's when they've been pruned properly. So it can look a little odd depending on the exact tree, but that shape is what we want to see. So on the left, we have a very extreme example. A full stub was left in there. And basically, again, trees don't actually heal, they grow around it. And literally that wound wood rolls inward and it meets in the middle. That's why we have the line on the right. The center gives us maybe a better understanding of that. So there we have a stub, but it's only a partial stub. So that wound response wood, that inward rolling wound wood, is larger on the top than the bottom because the top didn't have an obstruction. The bottom did. We left a little stub in there. So whenever we prune, we don't want to be leaving stubs because it actually never completely heals over. Again, that Dutch cut we talked about earlier to promote a branch in the same spot, special case, different scenario. But when we are doing cuts, we want to make sure that we're leaving that branch collar intact. And basically, you just look for those stack rings, those ridges at the end of a branch when it attaches another branch or a trunk, and cut just outside of that. And that is what allows to happen in that right-hand picture where it completely closes over. The tree doesn't have an entry point for disease or insects, and it continues growing healthy. We also want to think about the distance above a bud. So we're, again, we will be making heading back cuts, and we want to leave enough space above that bud to allow it to continue to grow. And so you can see some different examples there where we might be cutting too high, or we're cutting at an angle where water sheets onto that bud, or we're cutting too close to a bud. So that perfect cut there on the end, probably about a 1/4 inch above that bud or so, and slightly angled to allow water to run off of it better. It's one of those things where the larger the orchard, the more cuts you're making, the less picky you can be about this, but certainly taking the time to kind of get in the practice of making these cuts and leaving sufficient room for that bud to continue to grow is good. Occasionally you'll have a bud die, even when we've made a good cut. It's not a big deal. A bud below it will take over, but there are times when that means suddenly we now have a branch headed the wrong direction because the bud we leave behind, that apical or end bud, is going to focus the direction that that branch grows. So in this case, at the end, that bud facing to the right means that branch is going to grow to the right. So let's say outward from the tree. If that branch were to die and we have the alternating bud that points back into the tree, then suddenly we may have a branch that's growing the wrong direction. So things don't always work out the way we want. Good thing is the next year we can adjust that.
So the image on the right, I thought it was the opposite. Like if there's a little point. Oh, I guess that's the point that's gonna grow.
Correct. Yeah. So the projection on the right-hand side is actually a bud. That's not a branch. That's actually a dormant bud.
Okay.
And so especially this time of year when those buds are starting to swell a little bit, they'll be noticeable on those stems that we're cutting. They'll be very prominent. When we have a larger branch, and there's scenarios when we're going to need to do this, we always cut those branches in a 3-step process. The first step is we undercut. The reason we undercut a branch is to prevent it from stripping the bark off the tree trunk as it hinges and falls down. So if you've ever seen somebody start cutting at the top on a branch and then the weight of the branch causes that branch to break and fall, oftentimes, and sometimes it can be a function of the time of year, but you will see the bark start stripping down the trunk. The way we prevent that, it's simple as easy. We make an undercut first, maybe about 1/3 of the way through the branch, and then we go to the right of that or away from the trunk to make our second cut. And by doing that in 2 cuts, what happens is now we've removed all the bulk of that branch. It falls off. When we successfully make cut number 2, the branch is off that tree. So then we come back with cut number 3, and that's where we do the final cut. And so we don't have to worry about holding a branch up with one hand while we're using a handsaw or whatever. We're able to make that final cut just outside of that bark ridge, that branch collar, where we can make a clean cut that will heal faster. So again, ideally, these would be rare that we're doing these cuts, but even when we've done a great job annually with pruning, there's times where we may have some storm damage or something like that would cause us to remove a larger branch. And so understanding the 3-step process, undercut first, then a second cut outside the first to remove the branch, and your final cut to clean it up. Here's some more images to help show when we're talking about where we make our cuts. In the left-hand picture, the red line might be referred to as a flush cut. That's where people will basically just cut along the trunk, cut it even to the trunk. 99 times out of 100, that is not correct. You want to look for those ridges, and oftentimes they look like stacked circles or even wrinkles. Those are your actively growing cells, and we cut just outside of those so that wound wood rolls inward and completely closes. So we are not looking at flush cutting with the trunk. We are looking for that branch collar, and we're cutting just outside of it. This is important. If we don't do a good job with this, we don't have good wound closure. And again, we're looking at trees that we might be having in the orchard for a few decades. We want them to be as healthy as possible. There are some scenarios where we'll make some unusual cuts sometimes. If we have an upright growing branch and maybe a side branch, we can do what's called a bench cut. These are not common, but they do happen, especially maybe if we're renovating a tree that has gotten out of hand. So I just want to put this in here as an example of something that sometimes we will do. So we can make a sloping cut so water drains off of it a little bit above a branch that's already attached. So that side branch can then continue on growing. Dutch cut, mentioned it earlier. I won't beat it to death. We use this when we're trying to encourage another bud to produce a branch in the same spot. We see this done a lot with the high density orchard. They're using root stocks that are on trellises. This is something that's used quite a bit. So some specific things with stone fruits. Again, these are primarily in our area, peaches, plums, and cherries. Nectarines and apricots bloom way too early for our area. I am unaware of any nectarine or apricot that would reasonably fruit with any sort of commonality. So if you're getting peaches, sometimes 3 years out of 10, you're doing well in our area. Peaches are a challenge for our region. And it's just because they bloom so early.
Madam, you need to have 2 trees.
With peaches, it's not as critical to have a pollinator. it might be beneficial, but it's not critical. The problem with peaches in our area is they bloom too early. So we're going to be highly selective about what variety. I would be rigidly selective. If they don't have what I want, I would wait till next year to plant. There's no reason to plant a tree that blooms 2 weeks too early and is never going to fruit for you.
What is the language?
So hardiness is kind of the language, but we're talking about chill hours. So some catalogs, some online sources will literally list the number of chill hours required.
So the higher the chill
Higher the chill hours, the later it blooms. Literally, it has to be cold longer. Because what happens is once a plant satisfies the cold hours for chill hours, if we get nice weather for multiple days in a row, suddenly the environment is telling it to grow because it's already met the dormancy requirements that it has built into it. So we would want as late a blooming as possible for these things that are marginal. Peaches are marginal in our area. They're not annually reliable. And, some of it is, you can do some things where if you plant it near heat sinks, so if it's closer to a building where it can get some benefit from the heat sink or things like that, there are some strategies we can do. But peaches are not perfectly reliable here. Apples are much more reliable. They're not perfectly reliable either, but 8 or 9 years out of 10, you're going to get a crop on apples. It's occasionally we have late frost, and that can severely limit a crop. So it does happen, but not with the frequency we see with our stone fruits. So, and the problem with nectarine and apricots, they bloom way earlier than peaches do. So they are a beautiful tree. You can have them if you want a lovely early spring blooming tree, but they are going to bloom way too early to reliably fruit. There might be a rare year when it happens. Sweet cherries aren't the best for our area. The sour cherries, the pie cherries are better. Plums, some plums are definitely a no-go. So like a Santa Rosa plum, I would not plant a Santa Rosa plum. Again, too low a chill hours. So even plums are a little suspect in our area.
Most plants have that on the label.
You're going to have to look for it. No, I mean, and that's it. It depends where you're buying it from. The more hardcore fruit places will have it, but if you're going to a lot of co-op, I would doubt those trees would have it. Most local garden centers probably won't have it on there. You're going to have to go with a list in your mind or physically print it out. These are the candidates I want. And so, and especially on the stone fruits, even more so than the apples, but apples still the same thing to a certain extent.
Where's the best place to find that information?
Well, so looking at university resources, so you can find chill hour requirements on different university resources. I have a list of like recommended varieties for things that I can send folks in the resources at the end. All of those are suitable to our area. So if it's on that list, and there can be some differences. One might be 900, another one 950. But, and relatively speaking, they're very similar, close together. It's not where I would never buy the one that's 50 hours less than another one. But if they're on that list, and that list also doesn't only look at chill hours, it also looks at disease resistance and things like that as well. So it's worthwhile. And because I think variety selection is critically important to success. So I do think it's very important, and very often that means you're going to have to mail order these trees. It would not surprise me if you went with that list to retail garden centers around our area that you wouldn't find them available.
That's crazy.
So with these stone fruits, we are doing the open center or open vase type growth habit. You can see it there depicted in that picture. There's no clear central leader. It looks nothing like a Christmas tree. We want the scaffold branches to be evenly spaced around a trunk. Typically, it's 3 or 4, maybe occasionally 5. And we want those radially arranged. So kind of like think about around a circle. We want them evenly around that circle. So 3 works well to do that. We want to make sure we have enough ground clearance. So we don't want our lowest branches to be too close to the ground. Depending on how we want to manage these, we might be higher or lower. But again, we were talking earlier about 30 or so inches. We do want to be using limb spreaders to help train those limbs the first couple of years it's growing. That's going to help us get the spread we want, get the angles we want. And so it's important that we do that. Here's some more depictions of what we've already talked about with these stone fruit trees. Again, at planting, and in this one, and I will say, you will find, depending what resource you look at, some differences. Some resources will leave more of those desirable side limbs in place. They'll just cut them back severely, but leave more than a stub, such as referenced in the left. You see that aerial view where we have 4 branches in this case that are radially arranged around that central trunk. Again, a side view that shows us no clear single central leader.
Once you've done the top limb,
Yes, sir.
you'll do that.
You would not do that again, because what you're doing at planting is you are beginning to establish those main branches. The only time we might come back and redo that is if there was some sort of severe damage or something where we lost some of those main scaffolds we were establishing. That would be the only time that we would ever look at doing that,
So if
because
you got a 3-year-old tree, a peach tree, it looks sort of like the aerial view there now. With your help, it does. So basically, what I'm trying to do is just keep it from getting huge. I don't want it to be.
well, and that's it. So
Already trimmed.
So we absolutely, so if you look at commercial orchards are a good example of this. Once you establish the kind of maximum height you want in commercial orchards, typically it's based on the equipment they have for harvesting as well as spraying. They will pretty much keep that tree at that height. And so that goes back to where sometimes we might be doing some renewal cuts on a mature tree if we're not getting the production. And so we can absolutely use pruning as a tool to keep a tree to the desired height or sizing if it's limited in our garden and the space we have, or even just from a care perspective, we want it lower so that we have an easier time with the task. So yeah, so typically that establishment of scaffold branches, those main branches, happens at planting, maybe the next year, because a lot of times people will plant and maybe not prune, but it happens once. You're establishing your main architecture. You get it right once. There's no reason to do it over. On the right-hand side, we kind of have later. So that would be that first summer after we've planted, either in the fall or early spring or late winter. This is where we would be looking at, okay, if we have more branches popping out, we are removing those that are below our main scaffold branches because we don't want branches lower. We are removing portions of the scaffold branches, the buds that are popping, that are growing back more like a central leader tree. They're closing in our open center we created, and we would be removing things. You will probably have a tree that tries to reestablish a central leader. You're going to remove that. And so summer pruning is a great time to do that. At 1 year, you can see there where we have our 3 main scaffold branches that we established at planting. They're a little bit crowded. They have some of those buds that pop. There's branches that aren't desirable. They're below our scaffolds. And then at that dormant pruning, we basically clean it up some. But our 3 main branches are still the 3 branches we left initially.
Did you say remove the center leader that grew back?
Yes,
in
absolutely.
Summer
Yes.
or the dormant?
You can do that in summer because, and that's it. When we have buds popping and we know we don't want them there, when they're small, we can go in there and just pinch them out with our fingers. We don't.
This is like finger size.
Yeah, because again, when these first pop, and especially when we have that open center, you're going to see some branches that you know are totally growing in the wrong place. You can go in there and remove those as soon as you notice them. And I'd encourage you to be out there in your orchard and look at things. It does, I think, help you be better as an orchard person.
And you call that, what you just said, you snap it off.
Yep.
It's called what?
It's a summer pruning. So like in June, central leader. In this case, we're removing our central leaders. And what happens, again, it goes back to hormone flow and the way plants are designed and wired. They want to grow with one single growing point going straight up. Every branch wants to do that. And so we have to keep reminding it by pruning and training. Nope, that's not what we want. And so it does repeat. Once we get more mature tree, a few years old, there's less of that, in part because all those buds aren't being broken open by heading back cuts. We did heading back cuts on this. So we know we're going to have buds growing that we don't want to grow. So again, another depiction of exactly the same sort of information. I just kind of threw this in here because you will get a copy of the slides, just so you can see a little bit different illustration, a little bit different conversation about it, but pretty much it's the same thing. And here, one thing I did like about this one is that, you know, in bullet point 3, you're pruning off 60 to 80% of last year's growth. You are not allowing a tremendous amount of growth to remain. Only that growth, which is actually growing in the pattern you want. And again, one of my first statements I said to people, either don't prune or they don't prune enough. How many times do you think you've taken 80% off of the tree you pruned? A lot of people get nowhere near that. They would be afraid to do that much.
Kind of like deadheading.
Yeah, and that's it. And so just think about it. If you're not removing 60 to 80% of last year's growth on these stone fruits, you're probably not removing enough. Now, again, we're assuming the tree is growing well and doing good, but in a happy tree, 60% would not be excessive.
That sounds to me like just logically, you could get, that would really help that one limb get thicker and stouter and stronger.
It does.
Cutting 60 to 80% of last year's growth.
Yep.
And you keep doing that, it's gonna, you know, it's gonna limit how long it's gonna be, but allows the stem to get thick.
Exactly. And we can certainly allow those branches to elongate, and because it doesn't mean that we're always hedging a branch exactly at the same length. But what it means is we're going to have buds popping in the wrong place. We're going to have growth that ends up growing over top of each other. All those are the sort of things we're removing. So exactly at the end of the day, we're directing those energies into the main branches and thus the fruiting and thus our harvest. And so that's why we do all this. So our other main example are our apples and pears in a central leader. I think a central leader is a little bit easier of a tree to manage. The tree kind of wants to grow this way anyway. I think it's easier to have a more open tree than with a multi-leader tree. Doesn't mean you can't have a multi-leader tree. And sometimes I've been invited to an orchard and someone will have a tree in their backyard. They haven't maybe pruned in the past. They should have. It ends up being multiple leaders. Instead of saying, well, cut out that big part of the tree, you just leave it and deal with it. But I think if you're starting from scratch or near scratch with young trees, a central leader is an easier tree to manage overall. Here, you know, again, we already talked about you top it, you start establishing those main branches, and then basically you keep selecting that central leader each year. Some years you'll be subordinating or pruning back side branches severely, because what happens is if you leave a side branch taller than your central leader, the tree thinks that's the central leader because it's literally the highest bud growing. So we are often cutting back other branches to make sure that dominance is maintained by our selected central leader. And so, for instance, you can see there kind of the progression over time where frequently they are removing growth that could or would result in multiple central leaders or co-dominant leaders to maintain a single growing point. So this is one that's kind of a fairly standard annual practice. You're going to reestablish that central leader and make sure that it is what you want over time. I do know we're getting sort of long in time, so I don't want to stay too late tonight. But what about neglected fruit trees? So there's a lot of fruit trees that are neglected just because you didn't know what to do with it. So it may be a year or two older than it should be for some of this formational pruning, or maybe you have a tree that you inherited when you purchased property and who knows how old it is. So with neglected trees, it's never going to be a quick, easy solution. It's going to be a gradual thing. The biggest thing you start with is removing things that are obviously and noticeably problems. So dead limbs and branches, regardless of the size, we're going to remove them. We don't want to go in there and remove 80% of this tree at once, because if we do that, we're going to have an unbelievable amount of new buds growing next year. We almost create a scenario that we can't escape from. So we only want to start removing larger limbs, 1 or 2 at a time. We want to be thinking about how do we balance the tree, because oftentimes these trees are neglected. You end up getting dieback and things like that. So getting a balance to the tree is sometimes part of what we're doing, opening it up for more sunlight, and oftentimes removing branches at the top. Because again, a lot of this growth, if we don't control it, wants to go straight up. So very often we get very dense top canopies, and that causes problems for lower branches. They stay wetter, they don't get the sunlight. You can even have branches dying out because they're too much in the shade. So generally speaking, when we prune, 75% of the branches we take off are going to be in the top part of the tree, and maybe 50% in the lower part of the tree. But this is going to be gradual over time. This isn't just in one single season. But we got to open up the top so we get more penetration further down. And then we got to start thinning out the bottom as well. So it is a balancing act on the tree top and bottom.
So if it's a central leader though.
Yeah.
And it's that big, you're cutting that top though, the central leader.
So if it is a central leader tree, we hope it would be. That'd make our job easier. Generally, a neglected tree, I think you'll find it's not clearly a central leader. So you would try to establish that, and that can be challenging. And the reason I say it's probably not a central leader tree is all those water sprouts that like to grow straight up, those adventitious growths, are all competing to be the leader.
Right,
and so if you look at that tree, you'll probably see you have multiple trunks that are competing with each other. So you don't just want to go in and cut every single trunk, but you can start maybe each year 1 or 2 of those larger trunks, cutting them back, subordinating them to one central leader. So again, kind of the same process. You keep trying to shape it back to what you want. You're not going to get 100%. You can't take a tree that's not been pruned for 10 years and turn it into the perfect example. It doesn't happen. Can't happen. But you can make it better than it is today. And so that's what we're trying to do with this. When we have it, one of the places I say to start, whether it's a old neglected tree or even one that's just maybe a little bit out of hand, start with some easy things first. And I call them the 3 Ds: dead limbs, diseased limbs or wood. You look for cankers or other damage, and then just damaged limbs in general. Things get broken, deer chew on the end of it or whatever. If you just start with that, remove those out of that tree and then stand back and look, that's going to help you a lot, because lots of times you look at the job, it's overwhelming. Where do I start? Get the obvious things, the clear things done first, and that's going to give you a better idea of what's there and what you have to work with and maybe what you can start removing. After those 3 Ds, look at water sprouts. Water sprouts almost are never left. Never say never, but 9 times out of 10, we're removing water sprouts. Again, they're going straight up, and typically that's straight up into the branch above them, back into the tree, and they just aren't growing in a pattern that works for our tree to keep it open. So 9 times out of 10, we're removing water sprouts. So when you get started, even if it's a tree you've pruned on some, one of the first things you may want to do, if it's not really out of hand, just start removing all those water sprouts that hey, this isn't the branch I want. This isn't going the direction I want. By the same token, we can start looking at hangers or limbs growing down or on the underside of limbs. Occasionally, there are some that we want to do that, but I have seen a lot of trees that don't get pruned as frequently as they should. You can kind of walk underneath the tree if it's like a large standard fruit tree and look up, and there's like a hollow interior. And what happens is you have branches on the bottom, and it kind of is a cascading failure. What happens is the branches above bend down and it blocks the branches below, and it just keeps doing that. So generally you have nothing on the interior or very little, and just kind of like an outside hedge. That's not great. That's not what we want. We want a tree that is open, has growth throughout, has fruiting throughout. So getting rid of those limbs growing down, because it does happen. When those grow down, they push the ones below it down, and so on and so forth, and you just get a repeating kind of waterfall effect. So get rid of the hangers. The other thing, if you have limbs that are crowded, if they're rubbing each other, if they're growing directly over each other, and this can be sometimes we have some branches we've left and they're great branches, but suddenly it took the wrong direction on growing. It happens. And when that happens, you remove the part that shouldn't be there. And so there's nothing wrong with saying that branch I left last year didn't do what I expected it to do, so I'm going to remove it now. That's the process we go through. There will be branches you select and establish that over time you remove later because they're no longer useful to that tree and what you want. So if you just kind of do these steps, this will probably be more pruning than a lot of trees get in the first place. And so I would say don't think too much about it. Just get in there, start doing some of these obvious things that aren't working well. Once those are out of the way, then stand back and start thinking about, okay, what about future growth and making sure it stays open? And if I leave that limb, which direction does it ultimately grow? And so to me, it's like, this is where we start, and it gives us a really good start. I do want to mention there is one disease that our primary method of control for apples and pears, fire blight, is actually dormant season pruning. So this time of year, you're not going to see the dead leaves attached, probably. Sometimes you can, but what happens is we get a rapid death of these twigs, and typically it's smaller twigs, but it can kill large branches eventually. This is a bacterial disease. It enters the plant through the nectaries in the flower. Depending on the weather during flowering, the wetter it is, the more problems we have with it. So we can actually, and these are sometimes called strikes, where we see these dead limbs out there during the growing season. If we see that out there, we know we've got a job to do during the dormant season. Basically, I would encourage you not to go in there during the growing season and cut those out, because if we do it during the dormant season, the bacteria is dormant. It's not actively growing and producing, and we can cut it out with less concern about cross-contamination and things like that. So typically what we'd want to do is cut 6 to 8 inches below any visible infection to remove that. And then we want to take those limbs out of the orchard. I mentioned earlier, sanitation is important. Ideally, we'd love to see the leaves either chopped up with a mower so they break down fast and all our clippings out of the orchard, because there's a lot of diseases that they can overwinter in plant debris. And that means that's the new source next year for the diseases. So sanitation in the orchard is important. And again, I'm not telling you to rake all the leaves out, but if you go through there a couple of times with a mower, chop them up so they break down faster, that is better than just leaving, for instance, fruit or leaves sitting on the ground for them to still persist in the spring.
Adam, I missed a little bit. If you
Yep.
see this stuff as you're trimming your tree now,
Yes,
pruning it, go ahead and cut it off.
absolutely.
But
And
if
so
you're out there in the summer and it's growing.
Right. I would not remove it because there is the greater concern. If it's warm season, it is likely actively growing, producing bacterial cells, and we'd be concerned with cross-contamination. This time of year, you're probably not going to see those leaves attached, but if you get out there in your orchard, especially if you have some older trees, I would not be shocked if you see a little shepherd's crook, little twig. So that curling over the end is very distinctive. It's called shepherd's crooking. And even without leaves on it, it will be noticeable. Those tips will be dead. They'll be very dark. In the center, you see a canker, a sunken area on that stem from the dead twig right there. So what happens is it will infect a flower, then grows into the twig, and then grows into the branch. The branch can grow into the trunk. This is one reason why we want to remove root suckers whenever we're pruning. So if you have stems popping up from the roots, make sure you cut those off and keep those cut off, because if those were to get infected with, for instance, fire blight, that's a straight direct route to the root system. And if the root system gets fire blight, you're going to kill the tree quickly.
Is this, I know we have some canker, but is there different kinds of canker? Is this?
Yeah, so canker is more of a symptom. So canker is it's that sunken, depressed area, typically a different color than the surrounding
Yeah, it looks
bark
like
and
it's
wood.
healing like a little
And
on
oftentimes
branch.
it's a depression. It'll be physically sunken.
Mhm.
So a canker is a symptom. It is not the disease itself. So we can have other cankers with other issues as well. Good question. All right. Another disease that we do pruning on,
That's
black knot on plums.
flowering plum.
Yes. So very often ornamental plums have this problem, and ornamental plums typically are not sprayed or pruned much. And so the only way we can control this with the chemical is if we first remove all these growths. So you have to remove those growths, or don't waste your money on the chemical controls. It's not worth it. You
I
won't
got
have success.
2 trees look just like
Yep.
that. So I'm just gonna
And-
chop them all down, but I don't want to affect the other trees.
Right. Well, and so if you do have a tree that's severely infected, like there on the right,
Yeah.
removal is probably your best option.
Yeah.
Because that is severely infected. You could go in there, and if you think, if I remove all these corky growths on the branches, what tree do I have left?
Yeah,
And especially if we're talking aesthetically, you don't have much of a tree left. And so typically I would say remove it if it's
Mhm.
severely affected. Again, this honestly, I think is more common on ornamental plums than on our fruiting plums, but it is possible that a fruiting plum can have it. It's not going to look this severe in the beginning. Early forms, you don't necessarily see the black growth immediately. It takes time, but certainly there, if you were out there in the orchard, you would notice it before it got as severe as the picture on the right.
What's the cause? Is like imbalance in the soil?
No, that's actually a disease. So it's actually a disease that causes that.
Hmm. But there's no what weakens the tree's immune.
Well,
for-
so a weak tree is more susceptible, just as ourself. If our immune system is somehow compromised, we're more likely to. But no, I would not say there's direct link of, but yeah, droughts weaken trees, too much water weaken trees. I mean, oftentimes, especially in urban and suburban environments, trees are in less than ideal soils. They don't get the care they need anyway. They're stressed. They're more susceptible. So, I mean, if you have 20 trees and only 1 or 2 get it, it could be that those were, for whatever reason, more stressed. You will see differences in varieties. So when I talked about earlier, variety selection of fruit trees, I talked about resistance to diseases, or I think I did. Different varieties will have different resistance. So there could very well be some ornamental plums, for instance, that don't get this disease or rarely get it. And so again, variety selection is important. So if you are joining us, you can get the list of resources right now at your fingertips at this tiny link. It's a PDF. You'll have to download it, but it gives you 3 pages of clickable links. It's a compilation of resources from any number of different universities. I've tried to pick out the ones that I think provide the best information on the topic. So it's not just University of Tennessee resources. It's a number of others. And the ones that need to be appropriate for our seasonality are so. Pruning is basically the same wherever you're at. So that we have a little more license with recommending maybe wider ranging universities on some of those. There's an Oregon State one I remember specifically about pruning neglected trees that I like. So it's on there, as well as some others. So there's the link. Depending what device you're viewing this on, or if you're here in person, you can use your phone camera to scan the QR code, and that will take you to that document as well. And it is a PDF document that you have to download. You'll also get this in the email from me if you're registered. And so with that, I will take questions.